my art studio. Today we're going to be working in watercolor, and I'm going to be showing you two very simple sunset compositions to help you start to learn about paint blending and how your watercolors interact with each other. This composition I've done with all ages. You can always make it more detailed. It's always a great base place to start when you're learning how your watercolors interact with each other. So this is something beginners all the way up through adult will really enjoy. I today am going to be using my Arches watercolor block. As I mentioned in the first video about supplies, is that this is a high level material. I don't expect a beginner to have this paper. It's an investment. To create this piece, you can also use your mixed media paper or watercolor paper. And if you're using either of these two options, I would recommend taking your paper out and taping it to a flat surface with some of your tape. Frog tape's my favorite kind of tape to use for this. It gives the best line around the edge, but that will help stretch your paper so that you don't experience as much bubbling and warping in the paper while you're working, because we are going to be using a good amount of water for this project. Definitely, if it's loose in your notebook, this, or in your mixed media notebook, I will take it out, stretch it onto a flat surface with tape. One of my favorite flat surfaces to use is just a piece of cardboard. As far as other materials that you're going to need today, you need some water. For brushes, you really only need a very simple big flat brush for this. For the silhouette at the bottom, you may want a more medium round brush, a smaller round brush, or a smaller flat brush. The main work is going to be done with this flat brush. Paper towel, and then your paint set. Again, I've got the Prang semi-moist watercolors that I'm going to be using today, and then a pencil and eraser just to start out with. Once you've got your paper surface set up and you've got your workspace set up, you're going to use your pencil and eraser to just really loosely draw out the shape of the clouds that you see. One thing that will help the scale of your sky is if you draw your clouds smaller towards the horizon and larger towards the top. That will give the illusion of distance and help your sky have scale, meaning going from large to small. And when I think about these clouds in this composition, I always try to think of drawing a section of small clouds, a section of medium, and then a section of large. So with my pencil, I just have an HB pencil here and eraser. You do not need to draw out your silhouette at all. I'm just going to really lightly, and you might not even be able to see them until I start painting, draw some light cloud shapes. And I'm starting this section, I'm kind of dividing the sky into thirds: small, medium, and large. And clouds are an organic shape. You can draw them kind of however you want. I've seen all kinds of clouds. I'm not going to draw a whole bunch because I want the sky to be the star of this show. And I'm drawing even some of the bigger clouds going completely off. And it is important to draw lightly with a either hard or HB pencil. That will prevent the lead from getting into your paint, and you won't really be able to see the lines when you're done painting if you draw lightly. So if you've drawn really heavily, go ahead and take an eraser and take a moment to just lighten your pencil lines. If they're really dark, just do yourself a favor and lighten them now. Once you get there painting and the paint is wet, you're not going to worry about it. Now I'm ready to paint. So I've got my big flat brush. We're going to be working with all the paints wet as we're working, and we're going to work from the bottom to the top. And the key to this is making your paints be friends and be friendly next to each other. So when you're using wet on wet paint, you want to use paints that are going to blend nicely, or at least you want to know how they're going to blend. So I've got them kind of going yellow, orange, red, magenta, purple, and even this one I've got some nice blue up there. So you want to understand, this helps you understand how your paints are going to blend. For example, if I didn't want to do these colors and I wanted to go yellow to blue and it's wet on wet, you just want to know what's going to happen. Of course, if blue paint and yellow paint are wet, they're going to blend together and you're going to see some green there. So learning how to blend your paints and learning how they will mix is something exploratory that you can do at any time. It's a good exercise to just mix different colors together, see which blends you like the most. But for this, we're going to go inside out rainbow. So we got the red, orange, yellow. We don't have green, and then we go blue, indigo, violet. So it's kind of like we took it apart and put the two pieces like that. It's good to know. I like to call them either bridge colors or paints that play nicely with each other. They're friendly to each other and they blend in a way that makes it another pretty color. So with my paint, I'm going to use my paper towel here to just control how much water is on my brush. I do want it wet, but not super drippy at this point. I do need to kind of get my paint warmed up. I'm just putting a little water in it. You can either get water going in your paint tray, or you can off to the side in the top of your paint tray mix up a little blob of color if you're looking for a certain mix. I'm not right now, so I'm going to use it straight out of here. And I'm just going to really boldly start brushing it across the surface here. It's okay to use a lot of water for this. Pay attention to how much water your paper can handle. Once you start to see it really start bubbling, that's kind of your clue. This Arches paper can handle quite a lot, and this brush holds a lot of water, so be aware of both of those factors. I'm just kind of making a stripe of yellow. If you want it to be bolder, it's kind of like soup. If you water down soup, the flavor gets less strong. If you water down paint color here in watercolor, the color gets less strong. So now I do want some more color in here. While it's still wet, I'm going straight to the paint tray and getting more pigment on my brush without adding more water to what I already have. And I'm just having fun touching this into there and getting some more bold yellows. If it ever gets to be too much or it's too watery, then you should use your paper towel, find a clean spot, and you can see it like right there I made a drip. Just dab that up. If it gets to be too watery, you've got a puddle forming, you can use your watercolor to kind of dab it up. And once you do that and you're going to go to another area, make sure you refold and find a clean spot if you're going to dab some more. And you can see as the watercolor dries, even those spots where I just kind of dried it, it's softening. The watercolor continues to change as it dries, which is one of my favorite things about watercolor. So now while it's still wet, I'm going to go on to the orange. My personal choice, I have two oranges. I have kind of more red orange and a more yellow orange. I'm going with that yellow orange. Just really boldly again, and you're going to start to see me going around some clouds. I've got a couple clouds here. I'm kind of mapping out the width of this orange. Here's where the excitement starts, where the colors are going to blend together, and that's where we get some of that really pretty feathering. As I said, the watercolor keeps changing as it dries, and I really like that drying action of watercolor. I like how it feathers and you get these kind of pretty shapes. Here you can see some really bold feathering lines. This one I happen to smooth out a little more. So if you want it really smooth, just take your brush and pull it in between the colors, and that will soften that. And the more that you pull down without adding more paint onto your brush, the more it will soften the gradient change in between the two colors. I'm just going around the clouds here. All of my watercolors, I like them to be really bold. I like really bright, strong, vibrant colors in my artwork. That shouldn't surprise you if you've followed my artwork for any amount of time. All of my colors are really bold. I'm just, again, taking more orange and touching it into there without adding more water. Just kind of watching it as it dries and watching that play between the colors and the water as it dries on my paper here. Cleaning off my brush, and I'm gonna go to red, and I'm using a real cherry red here. I have two red choices. Again, I have like an orange red or a real cherry red. I'm choosing the cherry red because I have learned that I like the way the cherry red and the magenta purple that I'm going to use next interact. That's just part of learning your paints. If you use this more orange red, you know, that will interact really nicely with this orange, but with this particular next color, I don't like it quite as much. If you had a more pink paint, this one would be just fine with it. So that's part of just getting to know your paints. And I'm going to map out really boldly here where I want my red. And using this big brush is really fun and relaxing. It gives you these big bold strokes, and you start to be comfortable with the unpredictable nature. I mean, it's unpredictable, but if you practice with your paints, you'll start to understand and be able to predict how the paints are going to change as they dry a little bit. Look at that feathering. I just love that. I think that's gorgeous. Start to see some of my small clouds there. I'm going to move on towards the magenta, purples, blues. I'm going to start with a kind of magenta-y red, purple, more violet, and same thing, just kind of mapping out where I want it to go, going around my clouds. And and I always just really love when the paints get to mix together. And that's why we're working wet on wet, so the paints get to have that interaction. If we let this stripe dry, it won't interact and feather in the same way. And if you start to get a hard line, just kind of work it softly with your brush to soften that line. Unless you like the line, then just leave it. I'm just working back and forth horizontally. I want to kind of touch some into this red just because I feel like it. And watch what that does. And that's something that you can do to kind of level up this composition, is you can take some of the color above it and kind of stripe it lightly into your wet paints and just see kind of what happens. And kind of work some of these lines up and down. It's up to you. It's your preference. I'm excited because I'm ready to go on to purple. This is a much more cooler purple because I do want to have some room for some blue up there at the top. I love this bold purple. Mapping out my cloud there. I just love that, watching the color go spread around. And here we go into the magenta. I'm going to put a little bit under the cloud. I'm just going to take some down here, some lines. On to blue, and I have several blues here, a more turquoise teal blue or real royal blue. You could use both, really. They both play really nicely with purple. I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. Both very friendly to purple in different ways, so I'm going to use a little bit of both. Like, isn't that gorgeous? Look at that blend. One of my favorite blends is this tealy blue with purple. I use it in a lot of my watercolors. Just for fun, I'm gonna use some of this real more royal, dark, deeper blue, and so you can see the difference. And again, if it gets too light, get more pigment into your brush without adding more water to your composition. I'm gonna rub some blue under that cloud. Just take your time and enjoy yourself. Taking some purple up into this, and letting that water play happen. You kind of need to let it dry. Sometimes with watercolor, there's a little bit of wait time. The two things that we have to do next are the clouds and the silhouette. So we're gonna do the silhouette first. That's this along the bottom. Before we do that, this yellow has to be all the way dry. So we might have to wait just a little bit. I used a lot of water, and if you used a lot of water, you want it to be dry, because as we've learned, where the colors are wet, they will blend. So if we start using black to make a silhouette and a little bit of cloud shaping, and the paints around it are wet, the black will bleed into this gorgeous sky that we've just made. The way that you can tell if it's dry, obviously if it looks shiny and watery, it's still really wet. If it feels kind of cold to the touch, it's still wet too. Do yourself a favor, be patient. We need the yellow to be dry before we can go on to the next step. So I looked at my clock, and I did give this about 10 minutes to dry, and especially the yellow feels really dry. It doesn't feel cold. Some of the blue up here still feels a little cold, but since we're going to be working down here first, I'm okay with that. The watercolor will only go where it's wet. If the area surrounding it is wet, whatever color you use next will bleed and spread. If you want that to happen, be aware and use colors wet on wet like we did with the sky. I'm getting now kind of a medium round brush. For this, could also use a smaller flat brush, or I might use this small little brush a little bit too, so I'll keep that handy. Getting it wet, and then I'm going to go to my black. The black in this set of paint is really inky. It's really dark. I'll show you here. I'll put a little bit into my tray so that you can see how dark it is. It's really black. I usually don't use the black straight out of the paint reservoir here. I usually bring it off into my lid, and that way I can be in control of how dark I want it, or if I want to use it more watered down, you can add some water to your tray. We'll definitely want to use it really lightly for the marks that we're going to make in the cloud. I'm kind of getting two little puddles of water here. This is what this lid is for. That's why they've got these little dividers. You know, it's not just how it was made. I mean, it's for a mixing tray. There's some light. I'm getting some really light. So we're going to be using the black. I want dark for the silhouette. It's almost completely black. I mean, parts of it are lighter. It's just up to you whether you like it better completely solid or both of these options. You can kind of see through it, but I am using it full strength. Think ahead a little bit as to how you want your silhouette. Mountains, trees, pine trees, hills, a house, a structure of some other kind. Now, if you make your silhouette really large, that won't alter the scale of this piece. If you make it really small, the small things seem farther away, and then here I've got some larger things that brings them closer. The smaller things give it this depth and this scale, even though it's a black silhouette. This one's very simple. It's just straight across the bottom. This one's got a little bit of play with some medium, small, and larger objects. I think for this one, I'm going to do a little mix of both. Since I'm working right at the bottom of my paper, I'm going to do a few mountains, and then I'm going to do some far away things. So I'm going to start with just kind of my basic. This is just a line. You know, don't be afraid. Silhouettes, you can change because it's all filled in. So if you mess up, it doesn't really matter. You can just change your silhouette. And you can see why it'd be important that this is dry, because this black will just bleed right into this beautiful yellow that we worked so hard on. And this, you don't want it to be super watery because we're not working with it blendy. We kind of want it to stay where we're putting it. And you can see how it really changes from a line to when you fill it in. Silhouettes are a lot of fun. They're very easy and approachable. It's kind of like cloud. There's not really a right answer here because we're not painting something specific. These kind of look off in the distance. They are the largest thing I'm going to paint. To give those some scale, I'm going to paint some small objects over here. I'm actually switching to my smaller brush here. And when you're working with a new brush, get used to how much water the ferrule of the brush might hold, because sometimes you're painting and you've just dunked it in water and you turn your brush upright and a little droplet of water works its way down. Use your paper towel to control how much water is on your brush, not just the bristles, but also in the ferrule of the brush. So now I'm going to work just some little objects. I'm going to make some little trees. And I'm not thinking too hard about any of this right now. These are very simple shapes. And I think I want to paint kind of a little structure here. And again, since these are really large, I'm going to keep my structure really small. If that was difficult and you messed it up, just turn it into something bigger. Part of art is improvising, rolling with things when things don't go the way you thought they were gonna go. I'm gonna draw some really tiny little hints of trees over here. And I'm also almost making just dots right now with my brush. Now this really smooth part of the landscape, I'm just going to kind of mess up a little so that it's not so perfectly smooth and straight. And that gives your piece some interest. That's the great thing about silhouettes. They leave a lot to the imagination. We're not having to describe every little thing in this art piece. We're letting the viewer fill in the blanks as to what these exactly are. I'm gonna go to my big brush for starters. I'm gonna work on the clouds a little bit. And And for this, I want to use some really light gray. Some of my black has blended with some other dried paint that I have over here, so I'm just going to clean this up because it's going to be a color that will be more brown and I don't want it to be. So I'm cleaning that up, starting afresh. Don't be afraid to make those changes so that you get the color that you want. I'm going to put some fresh water. My brush already has actually quite a lot of black on it, so this is pretty easy. This is going to be actually probably as light as I want it. And again, control how much water is on your brush with your paper towel. Now for this, I'm going to just be lightly adding some shadowing and some hints. We're not going to describe every little detailed part of the cloud. This is a very loose composition. I'm not going to fill in the cloud either. We're just making some marks that give this idea and impression of the cloud. We're not having to describe every little scientific detail, but the viewer can tell that they're shadowy clouds. And you can do this with lines, you can do it with curve marks, you can use some darker marks or some lighter marks. So I'm using that light gray watery mix that I just made. I'm going to start with this medium one, just kind of get warmed up. And I'm going ahead and putting the black right on the edge of my cloud. And that's pretty dark. Let me get a little bit more water. If you do something that you really don't like or you filled it in too much while it's wet, just take a clean part of your paper towel and you can lighten it. And depending on your paper, it's almost even like an eraser. You can lift it. That depends on your paper though, if you can lift it completely or not. It might still be there just a little bit. You can see why it's important that it's all dry at this point because I'm touching it into the base of my cloud. If the blue here was still wet, then this black would bleed into my beautiful sky. And you can play with how dark or how light you want it. Just take it step by step. You can always make it darker. It can be harder to lighten it if it's still wet. Like I said, you can lift it a little with your paper towel. You can get a little more water on your brush and lighten it. Try to be loose and not have in your mind how it should go. Try to go with what's happening. Try to let it become the cloud that it's going to be. Up in the top, I made really bold marks. And again, it comes to this scale thing that we've been talking about. Down below, I'm using the tip of my brush to make smaller marks. And that gives the clouds some more scale. And the clouds down low that are farther away, that are smaller, you will be have a little less information on them because they're farther away. And just kind of let it be. Let it be what it wants to be. You don't have to tell everyone exactly what all of this is in order for it to make complete sense. If things get really harsh, you can take some water and just soften them. Play with softening things and absorbing them with your paper towel to soften them. And just remember that the paint's gonna go where it's wet. So if you don't want paint to bleed, wait till it dries. Drying it with your paper towel is not the same as waiting for it to dry. Another way that you could add a little bit more detail to this is when it is dry, you could take a pen or a paint marker and add teeny tiny little details like a fence or power lines or a windmill, but you'd want to wait for your black to be all the way dry before you do that. Here's my final piece. It's still drying a little bit, but I'm really happy. I love the vibrant colors, the change of colors, and the feathering. And I hope that you enjoyed learning how to make an easy color blended sunset sky. I would love to see how yours turned out. Happy creating!